my husband tried to roast me in public. It backfired spectacularly. Last night was supposed to be a normal, run-of-the-mill Thursday. It was supposed to be a nice dinner out with my husband, Carlos, and his two best friends from college, Alex and Becky. We were at a new, trendy restaurant downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick, Edison bulbs, and a menu where everything is described as artisanal. Carlos had been dying to try it for months, and the place was buzzing with the loud, chaotic energy of a city celebrating a local sports victory. The drinks were flowing, the laughter was loud, and for a little while, I was actually having a good time, despite the familiar, low-grade feeling of being an outsider in the tight-knit world of his college memories. We were all catching up, a comfortable, if somewhat superficial, back and forth of work stories and weekend plans. I was mostly quiet, a contented observer, listening to them rehash the same old, well-worn stories from their glory days. I hadn't gone to school with them, a fact that always seemed to relegate me to the role of a smiling, nodding spectator in these conversations, but after 5 years of marriage, I was used to it. And then, Alex, in a moment of what I am sure was pure, innocent curiosity, turned to me and asked the question that would detonate our entire life. "So, how did you two actually meet?" It was a simple question, the kind of question people ask couples all the time. But the moment the words left his mouth, I saw a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in Carlos. His easy, relaxed posture tightened, and a strange, almost predatory, glint appeared in his eyes. It was a look I hadn't seen before, a mixture of smug superiority and a simmering, inexplicable annoyance. I was about to launch into our usual, slightly embellished but sweet, story of how we met, but Carlos cut me off, his voice a little too loud, a little too performative. "Oh, her," he said with a dismissive, theatrical eye roll that was clearly meant for his audience. "She basically begged me to date her." I froze, my wine glass halfway to my lips, the cheerful, noisy chatter of the restaurant suddenly fading into a dull, distant roar. The entire table went quiet for a split second, a tiny, awkward bubble of silence in the middle of the boisterous room. I thought, for a fleeting, hopeful moment, that he was joking, that this was the prelude to some sarcastic, self-deprecating punchline. But then he continued. "Look at her," he said, gesturing towards me with a flick of his wrist, as if I were a piece of furniture, an object to be appraised and commented on. Desperate, average, and just lucky I was bored enough to say yes that night. Alex and Becky let out a small, uncomfortable laugh, the kind of nervous, choked sound people make when they are so profoundly uncomfortable they don't know how else to react to something so wildly, shockingly inappropriate. I didn't laugh. I couldn't even speak. A hot, prickling flush of pure, unadulterated humiliation spread across my neck and face. I was gripping my wine glass, so tightly I was genuinely afraid the stem might snap in my hand. But Carlos, my husband of 5 years, the man I had built a life with, he wasn't finished. The waiter had just, with a mercifully oblivious cheerfulness, brought our appetizers, a colorful platter of cured meats and cheeses. Alex and Becky, in a desperate attempt to move past the deeply awkward and uncomfortable moment, immediately began reaching for the food. But Carlos was not to be deterred. He was on a roll, and he had an audience. "Honestly," he continued, taking a long, slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes fixed on me over the rim of his glass, "I'm only still with her because I just don't have the time to train someone hotter." Alex, to his credit, looked genuinely shocked this time. "Damn, bro," he muttered, his voice a low, almost inaudible sound that wasn't exactly a challenge, but was at least an acknowledgement of just how far over the line Carlos had just gone. Becky, for her part, had suddenly become intensely, almost surgically, focused on her phone, her thumb scrolling through her Instagram feed, as if her life depended on it. No one, not his best friends, not the people who had known him for over a decade, told him to stop. I sat there, a prisoner in my own life, a silent, humiliated spectator at my own public execution, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Was this actually my husband? The same man who, just last week, had left a sweet, loving note on the kitchen counter for me before he left for work? The same man who had held my hand through my father's long, difficult illness? "Carlos, what the hell?" I finally managed to say, my voice a small, tight, and almost unrecognizable whisper. He looked at me then, his expression one I had never, ever seen before in our 5 years together. It was a look of pure, undisguised contempt, the look you might give to something disgusting you had just scraped off the bottom of your shoe. He then, with another theatrical, dismissive eye roll, turned back to his friends. "See what I mean?" he said with a sigh, as if he were the long-suffering one in this scenario. "So sensitive. Can't take a joke." He rolled his eyes again, a gesture that was now beginning to feel like a physical blow. "This is what I have to deal with, every single day." Alex, a man I now saw was a spineless enabler, cleared his throat. Maybe we should just change the subject, he suggested weakly. But Carlos was on a roll now, his cruelty fueled by the 3 strong whiskeys he had consumed before the food had even arrived, and by the rapt, if uncomfortable, attention of his audience. You know what's really funny? He continued, his voice getting louder, more performative. When we first met, she acted all confident and independent. You know, had her own life, her own friends. And then, once we got married, boom, he clapped his hands together. A sharp, ugly sound that made me flinch. Clingy, needy, always asking where I am, who I'm texting. It's exhausting. I just stared at him, completely and utterly blindsided by this grotesque and entirely fictional caricature of our life together. Carlos, stop, I said, my voice a little stronger this time, a plea for him to just, for the love of God, stop. What? He shot back, his face a mask of feigned innocence. I'm just being honest. They're my best friends. They deserve to know the real you. He turned back to them, a conspiratorial grin on his face. She thinks I don't see how she checks my phone when I'm in the shower. I had never, not once in our entire 5-year marriage, checked his phone. The accusation, so baseless and so malicious, made me feel physically ill. Becky, in another pathetic attempt to defuse the situation, chirped, maybe we should order some more drinks. But Carlos just waved her off, his hand a dismissive, arrogant gesture. No, I'm just getting to the good part, he insisted, his eyes, which were now slightly glassy and unfocused, locking onto mine again. You want to know why I really married her? No one answered. No one stopped him. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intimate, and deeply cruel whisper, a whisper that was meant only for me, but was loud enough for the entire table to hear. Let's be real. No one else wanted her. I was doing her a favor. And in that single, brutal, and life-altering moment, something inside me, some deeply suppressed and long-dormant part of myself, finally, irrevocably, and with a beautiful, liberating violence, snapped. The 5 years of our marriage, the countless shared memories, the easy, comfortable love I had so foolishly believed we shared, it all collapsed, turning to dust in the space of a single, hateful sentence. Without saying a word, without a single, tearful, or dramatic pronouncement, I stood up from the table. Carlos looked up at me, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face, clearly expecting me to flee in tears, to fulfill my role as the sensitive and dramatic wife. I reached for my full, untouched glass of Coke, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. I held it, for a single, pregnant and deeply satisfying second, directly over his perfectly coiffed and deeply punchable head, just long enough for the smug smirk to falter, just long enough for a flicker of genuine fear to appear in his eyes. And then, I straight up dumped the entire 16-ounce glass of sticky, sugary liquid all over him. It cascaded down his hair, down his stupid, shocked face, and soaked the front of his expensive and now ruined white shirt. He just sat there, sputtering, his mouth agape, a pathetic, dripping monument to his own arrogance. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face was almost worth the pain of his words. I placed the empty glass down on the table with a quiet, definitive click, grabbed my purse, and, without a backward glance, I walked out of the restaurant, out of the life we had built together, and into the rest of my own. I could hear Alex, in the stunned silence that followed, muttering a single, awestruck, holy expletive as I left. I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel regret. I just felt a strange, exhilarating, and completely intoxicating sense of freedom. The moment the cool night air hit my face, the adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins began to recede, replaced by a violent, full-body tremor. My hands were shaking so badly, I couldn't get my car keys out of my purse for a full minute. I just stood there on the crowded sidewalk, the cheerful, oblivious chatter of the city swirling around me, and I stared at the traffic, my mind a blank, white screen of pure, unadulterated shock. Did I just do that? Is it really over? My phone, of course, immediately began to buzz, a relentless, angry insect in my purse. First, it was the texts, a barrage of them. Carlos. Alex. Carlos again. I ignored all of them. I finally managed to get my keys, and I walked the 2 blocks to the parking garage, my heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the pavement. I got into our car. Yes, our car, the one that was technically in both our names, a fact that would, I knew, become a point of contention later. But in that moment, I couldn't have cared less, and I just sat there in the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do next. Should I drive to my parents' house? A friend's? Should I just find a cheap motel and disappear for a few days? I ended up driving home, to the apartment we shared, a place that no longer felt like a home, but like a crime scene. I had a fleeting, almost hopeful, thought that he might be stupid enough to try and beat me there, that I could have the small, satisfying victory of locking him out. But he didn't. I let myself into the quiet, empty apartment, and the sheer, oppressive normalcy of it all was a fresh, jarring blow. His jacket was still on the hook by the door. His worn-out sneakers were still kicked off in the hallway. The dumb, oversized mug he used for his morning coffee was still sitting on the counter, a crusty, brown ring at the bottom. I thought about throwing it against the wall, about shattering something, anything, to match the chaotic, splintered feeling inside me. But I didn't. I washed my sticky, coat-covered hands, changed out of my nice dinner clothes and into a pair of old, comfortable sweatpants, and I waited. He didn't come home that night. I heard the buzz of the front door intercom around 1 in the morning, his angry, slurred voice demanding to be let in, but I just ignored it. My phone continued to light up the dark bedroom every 15 minutes with his increasingly angry, and then pleading, calls. At 2 in the morning, I finally, and with a deep, cleansing satisfaction, blocked his number. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of his key in the lock, half wishing he would try to break in, just so I could have the pleasure of throwing something heavy at his head. He didn't. When my alarm went off at 6, I had gotten maybe 3 hours of fitful, anxious sleep. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, the events of the previous night playing on a relentless, ugly loop in my mind, and then I got up and made coffee, my movements slow and robotic, a zombie in my own life. I had thought, in some small, naive part of my brain, that he would wake up the next morning, sober and consumed by a deep, profound, and soul-crushing regret. I had thought he would at least try to apologize. I should have known better. The first thing I saw when I, in a moment of pathetic, hopeful weakness, unblocked his number, was a wall of texts, a manifesto of his own delusional, narcissistic reality. You embarrass me in front of my best friends. You owe me a formal apology. You are blowing this entire thing way out of proportion. Alex and Becky think you're completely crazy. You need to come fix this. Now. I just stared at my phone, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all. Not a single "I'm sorry." Not even a hint of remorse. He had, in his own twisted, self-serving mind, already rewritten the narrative. He was the victim. I was the unhinged, crazy wife. I started to type out a long, furious, and deeply satisfying response, a detailed, point-by-point rebuttal of his insane version of events. And then I stopped. Why bother? He didn't care about the truth. He only cared about winning. And that, I realized with a dawning, sickening clarity, was what it had always been about with Carlos. The need to win. The need to be the smartest, the coolest, the most dominant guy in a room, even if it meant systematically and cruelly humiliating the person he was supposed to love and protect. I went to my parent house. I needed backup. I needed a sanctuary. I told them everything, every ugly, humiliating word. My mother, bless her heart, immediately went into full-on mom mode, all fluttering hands and concerned questions about whether he had hit me. My dad, a quiet, stoic man who rarely showed his emotions, just sat there, his jaw clenched, his fist tightening on the armrest of his chair. He didn't say a word for a full minute, and then he just stood up and walked out of the room. A few minutes later, I heard the garage door open. Carlos, of course, showed up a few hours later, a swaggering, uninvited guest in the middle of our family crisis. He walked into my parents' kitchen, his face a mask of wounded, victimized indignation, and he immediately began to demand an apology from me, in front of my own parents. He was loud, aggressive, and when my father stepped between us, a silent, immovable wall of paternal protection, Carlos actually tried to push him out of the way. My dad shoved him back, not hard, but with a firm, an undeniable finality. And in that moment, I saw the real Carlos, the one who had been hiding behind a mask of charm and humor for 5 years. He was a bully, a coward, and a man who was so consumed by his own ego that he was willing to physically confront a man twice his age in a desperate attempt to regain control. He finally stormed out, his threats and his curses echoing behind him, and my mother, who had been so strong, finally broke down and cried. The days that followed were a chaotic, messy, and deeply public war. Carlos, having failed to intimidate me in person, took his campaign to social media. He posted a long, rambling, and almost comically self-pitying story about betrayal and being stabbed in the back, complete with a dramatic, artfully blurry photo of his coke-stained shirt. He began a systematic campaign of messaging our mutual friends, my family, anyone who would listen, feeding them a carefully crafted narrative in which I was the unstable, hysterical, and violent villain, and he was the poor, long-suffering victim. Some people, the ones who only knew the charming, funny, life-of-the-party version of Carlos, they bought it. But the people who truly knew me, the people who had seen the small, subtle ways he had been undermining and belittling me for years, they didn't. Alex, his supposed best friend, sent me a string of texts, a mixture of a half-hearted apology and a desperate plea for me to just talk to him. Becky, the Instagram-scrolling coward, even sent me a message, a gossipy, information-gathering probe disguised as a concerned check-in. The divorce, when it finally came, was as ugly and as contentious as you would expect. He fought me on everything, from the division of our shared furniture to the custody of our dog. He tried to claim that I owed him money, that I had stolen the television, that I was emotionally unstable and therefore not entitled to a fair settlement. But I had my own weapon now. I had the truth. And I had a very good and very expensive lawyer. The final, and in many ways, the most satisfying, chapter of this story came not in a courtroom, but at a wedding. My cousin was getting married, and because the universe has a sick and twisted sense of humor, both Carlos and I were on the guest list. I went, my head held high, and I watched as he, now a social pariah in a room full of people who knew the truth, was forced to confront the wreckage of his own making. He tried to corner me by the bathrooms, to launch into another of his self-pitying monologues, but I just looked him in the eye, and with a voice that was as cold and as clear as a winter morning, I told him to leave me alone. And then, in the middle of the reception, in front of our entire, extended family, he got into a drunken, screaming match with his own mother, a final, public implosion that was the perfect, tragic, and deeply satisfying end to his reign of terror. He was escorted out of the wedding by the groom, a final, humiliating exit from a life he had so carelessly and so arrogantly destroyed. I don't know what happened to him after that. I don't care. My life is quiet now. It is peaceful. And it is, for the first time in a very long time, entirely my own.